All right, we are starting. Welcome everyone to Radical Hope in Feverish Times, a webinar series that explores the work of artists, critical thinkers, digital activists, and communities responding to the challenges of war, authoritarianism, disaster, and climate change in ways that build possibilities for hopeful, collaborative, and richly more than human futures. The series is sponsored by the J.S. Woodsworth Chair in the Humanities, dedicated to engaged humanistic education, highlighting moral courage, passion for truth, and social empowerment. The SFU, that's Simon Fraser University Institute for the Humanities, in its 43rd year of supporting humanities in the public sphere, and Ecoculture Lab, which seeks new forms of conversation and collaboration toward ways of life that are ecologically viable, aesthetically inspiring, and socially just. Webinars are recorded and will be made available on the websites of the Institute and of Ecoculture Lab. This fall's webinars are taking place live on the Burnaby campus of Simon Fraser University, which respectfully acknowledges the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kikite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Sawasan peoples on whose unceded traditional territories our three campuses reside. The theme of today's webinar takes seriously the somewhat utopian slogan of many a social movement that another world is possible, by looking at concrete examples where that sense of possibility is being achieved in some fairly unconducive environments. The emphasis is less on the dream of other possibilities and more on the how. We're very grateful today to be joined for this conversation, unfortunately not by Debbie Bookchin, who wrote me just a few hours ago that she broke her ankle yesterday morning and is needing to lie in bed. But we're very fortunate to have Arthur Pye jump in at the last minute in her place. Arthur Pye is an activist who has spent significant time in Rojava and will be speaking on more or less the topic that Debbie was prepared to speak about. And also we're joined by Brian Tokar, educator, activist, and author or editor of multiple books, including The Green Alternative, Earth for Sale, Toward Climate Justice, Redesigning Life, and Climate Justice and Community Renewal. The speakers will speak for up to 45 minutes or 50 at the max, which should leave us at least another 20 minutes or more for Q&A and informal discussion. In the meantime, if you'd like to share any questions or comments in the chat, you should be able to do that. You're welcome to do that. And with that, I'll turn things over to our first speaker, who will be Brian Tokar. So Brian, if you'd like to share your screen.
Yeah, I will in just a minute, but first I just want to offer my greetings to everyone there in the classroom at SFU and everyone who's joining us on Zoom. I see about 30 people participating in this meeting altogether. That's really terrific. And thanks to Adrian for inviting me and looking forward to hearing from Arthur about his personal experiences on the ground in Rojava in recent years. What I'm going to try to do in 20 minutes or so, which is a little bit challenging, is give you a very quick overview of the broad outlook of social ecology, a little bit about the movements that social ecology has influenced over the decades, and give you a quick glimpse at some of the things that we're currently doing around the Institute for Social Ecology, which celebrated its 50th anniversary just last year. We've been doing radical ecological education since the 1970s. And it's taken different forms at different times, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that. So I will share my screen now. Um, Except I think I closed that window. So now I'll share my screen. And there we go. So this slide offers a very abbreviated version of what social ecology is about. And I generally describe it as an evolving understanding of relationships between our human communities and the natural world. And I break it down into components here, kind of following the logic of the work of Murray Bookchin, who is the founder of social ecology. Murray, of course, is Debbie Bookchin's father. He began this work back in the 1950s and early 60s at a time when people like Murray, who was very much a creature of what we used to call the old left of the 1930s, were becoming increasingly aware of the limitations of the kind of labor politics that had sustained the left for several generations, and also coming to see, as Murray eventually concluded, that the emerging environmental crisis was potentially an even more profound threat to the capitalist system and all its inequities and injustices than the contradictions around the workplace that had been at the center of left politics pretty much until then. So I'm going to kind of walk you through this series of evolving understandings as quickly as I can. It would take me easily the full 20 or 30 minutes to begin to do justice to these ideas. So I'm going to offer a very much abbreviated overview and then show you some images uh, looking at some of the movements that social ecology has influenced. Um, so Murray's elaboration of social ecology, and of course, many of us have contributed to the continuing development of social ecology since Murray's passing, and new and important material continues to come out to this day. But Murray's exploration of social ecology really began with a fundamental critique of politics as usual, again, flowing from an understanding of how the ecological crisis was beginning to emerge as a threat to capitalism as we know it, with its overwhelming drive toward growth for the sake of growth and accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Uh, Murray came to conclude that ecological and social problems are inherently related, and in fact, that the environmental problems that the world was becoming increasingly aware of in the 60s were fundamentally social and political in nature, that the kind of environmentalism that thrives on technical fixes and small policy adjustments was inherently incapable of addressing the magnitude of the problems that we're experiencing to this day. And Murray concluded that the emerging ecological crisis was fundamentally a product of the dynamics of capitalism, and even more so, a product of the historical legacy of domination and social hierarchy. That conclusion led Bookchin to an exploration of the radical anthropological literature of his time and of the broad sweep of human history, trying to understand the origins of relationships of hierarchy that, in his view, led to the proliferation of a myth in Western culture that it's the role of humans to dominate the rest of the natural world. Rather, Bookchin saw the myth of the domination of nature as a direct outgrowth of patterns of social hierarchy and domination. He looked to the values of many indigenous cultures of both the past and present, principles that help us appreciate ways that people can live differently on this earth. Not out of any sense of nostalgia for a lost past, as various other political currents have continued to do over the decades, but to really give us an understanding of the broad scope of human potentialities. He looked at the anthropological literature to better understand principles of interdependence and reciprocity between humanity and the rest of nature, notions of unity in diversity and of complementarity of social roles. He looked to history for an understanding of the historical tension between emerging tendencies toward domination and the long legacy of freedom. And Murray really saw that if we could rediscover and further elaborate some of these core principles that emerge from anthropology, from an understanding of what he called organic societies, and bring them together with modern notions of autonomy and universalism, that it could potentially usher in a new era of human freedom. That led to a philosophical inquiry, trying to better understand the emergence of human consciousness from natural evolution and the links between natural and social evolution. And this is a very in-depth exploration that I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on, but Bookchin believed that natural evolution tends toward abundance, increasing complexity, creativity, innovativeness, and that human reason as the outcome of those tendencies in evolution had the potential to actually be a positive and creative force rather than a primarily destructive one in the natural world. Over time, this inquiry also evolved into a political strategy, which came to be known as communalism, partly honoring the legacy of the Paris Commune that the world celebrated 150th anniversary of just a couple of years ago. It's a politics of decentralism, of direct democracy, of reclaiming the decisions that are currently dominated by powerful corporate interests that so dominate our lives, and the ways in which institutions of direct democracy, like town meetings and popular assemblies, can begin to take that power back. Um, it's a politics of confederalism, of counter institutions, creating new institutions that expand on liberatory potentialities and ultimately re-empower communities and also transcend the kind of parochialisms that we see so much today in formations that aspire to ideas that claim to aspire to ideas of local power. And then finally, the long range reconstructive vision of social ecology, of restoring harmony between human communities and the natural world, and playing that out through a variety of practical experiments in living differently on this earth. And so the Institute for Social Ecology, as we'll see in a minute, was one of the first places where people could come. This is more than 50 years ago, and learn how to grow food organically, how to practice permaculture, how to do green building and work in renewable energy technology at a time when only a few hobbyists scattered around North America and other parts of the world were engaged in that kind of work. So over the decades, social ecology has come to influence a host of popular movements, beginning, of course, with the emerging environmental movements of the late 1960s and early 70s. The first movement that really explicitly embraced many of the lessons of social ecology is depicted on this slide. This is the movement against nuclear power that had its heyday in the late 1970s and early 80s. Here in New England, we had a very decentralized, affinity group-based organization that had a partial success in shutting down a particular nuclear development on the coast of New Hampshire, on the Atlantic coast of New Hampshire. One reactor got built, another one was canceled. It cost vastly more than expected, but also was really the beginning of the end of that 1960s and 70s wave of nuclear power development in the United States. This movement, which was called the Clamshell Alliance, and it's actually some people who are active have been coming back together in recent years, and you can find a lot of current information as well as old history online at clamshellalliance.com, including analysis of the current push for nuclear power, which is a fundamentally false solution, I would argue, to the climate crisis. But what was distinctive about that movement was the way it brought together a politics of direct action with a reconstructive and, in many ways, prefigurative understanding of the kind of world we want to create, what a world beyond nuclear power and fossil fuel dependence might look like. And that was manifested in some of the early experiments carried out by the Institute. And this is Kate Farm in Plainfield, Vermont, which is where the Institute ran programs for the first 5 or 6 years of its existence. And as you can see, it was a demonstration site for early experiments in renewable energy. Bookchin believed that the oppositional and reconstructive dimensions of social movements are fundamentally linked. And in many ways, this was a key expression, along with the forms of organization that this movement sought to practice. And there is some, complicated history there as well, of course, was one of the earliest expressions of that. Very quickly, the Institute was involved in early discussions around ecology and feminism, trying to frame a third way beyond rather economic reductionism and the kind of feminist essentialism that became popular in the 80s and 90s, arguing for a more dialectical understanding of how women's consciousness, and we would add consciousness of non-binary people as well today, is both shaped by oppression and its historical associations with nature, and that understanding that in a dialectical way helps realize the liberatory potential of these ideas for all people. Uh, Social ecologists were involved in the early years of green politics in North America, uh, trying to get beyond narrow ideas of party politics and arguing for a grassroots, fundamentally ecological centered movement from below when the emerging Green Party in the US proved unable to uh, manifest that vision. A lot of us got involved in formations like the Left Green Network and the Youth Greens that, among other things, did this big action on Wall Street for the 20th anniversary of Earth Day in 1990. Social ecologists were very active in the global justice movement that in many ways uh, reach the awareness of the world around the huge action against the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999. And that was really the first movement in many years at that time to continue the prefigurative legacy of the anti-nuclear movement, renewing ideas about direct democracy within the movement as it continued to evolve. In Seattle, in Washington, D.C., several months later, and then a year after that in the streets of Quebec City, where the Institute was a major hub on the U.S. side of the border for people organizing to go to Quebec City to challenge the annual meeting of the G7 heads of state. For many years, we were involved in work around genetic engineering of food. This is the farmer delegation at a huge rally we had in Boston, challenging a convention of the biotech industry in 2000. Those actions continued every year. In 2002, we were in Toronto for an event in collaboration with the Council of Canadians and the Ottawa-based Polaris Institute, very holistic, internationally focused, farmer-centered, but also focused on critiques of the pharmaceutical industry, of move toward new generations of biological weapons, bringing together a whole host of issues every year in various cities around North America. In Vermont, we worked in our town meetings to organize against genetic engineering in well over 100 towns in Vermont and across northern New England that still have active town meeting structures, passed resolutions against GMOs, and proceeded to try to implement those. We were involved in the first wave of climate justice actions. These are environmental justice activists in Richmond, California, that had just defeated a major oil refinery expansion, and the climate justice paradigm from the beginning brought together indigenous and other land-based movements from around the world with grassroots environmental justice activists, and also helped continue some of the overtly anti-capitalist dimensions from the Seattle era global justice movement, really trying to better understand the systemic roots of the climate crisis, challenge false solutions, and also begin to articulate a more comprehensive long-range vision of a world beyond fossil fuels. We were very active in Occupy Wall Street and other occupies around the continent, um, and brought our experience with advocacy for direct democracy to that movement. And then, of course, in the years immediately after that, we began to become aware of the revolution that was emerging in southern Turkey and northern Syria, which we'll hear about from Arthur, that was also very much inspired by this body of ideas. Very quickly, I just want to show you some of what the Institute is currently involved with. This is from our website at social-ecology.org. We have online classes on a whole variety of related topics. We have a blog. We do special events, also mostly online, and also in-person intensive seminars at least once a year and other in-person gatherings. We have a series of interviews with mostly Global South activists hosted by Kali Akuno from Cooperation Jackson. And after those events happen, the recordings, along with recordings from many of our in-person events, are available on the ISC's YouTube page. So check us out, get in touch. There's a way to get in touch through a module right on the website. And I hope many of you will come and see us at some of our events in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I forgot to mention that you are a long-time faculty member of the Institute for Social
Yeah, I
Ecology.
want to hear if he gets to my question. I'm going to.
Wait a second. I was like,
Someone has their mic on. So, which was co-founded by Marie Bookchin and Dan Kotterkoff back. You said it was 50 years. Was it 1970 something, early 70s?
74, yes. We had our 50th anniversary event just a little over a year ago.
Great. Okay, so let's move on to our second speaker. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Debbie Bookchin unfortunately emailed me this morning saying that she is unable to make it because she broke her ankle yesterday and must lie in bed. But Arthur Pai has generously agreed to step in and to speak about his experience in Rojava in northeast Syria. Arthur, if you'd like to turn your mic and video on and share your screen. Thanks again for joining us. And if you'd like to introduce yourself as well, which I didn't do with the slide uh, for you, a last minute variation.
Of course, of course. No, thank you so much for having me. As you said, my name's Arthur. I am a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, which is a group based in the US here focused on uh, grassroots advocacy and education about the Kurdish freedom movement and about the autonomous governing project in northeast Syria. Um, so I've been brought in at the last minute, as you said, and so apologies that you don't get Debbie Bookchin today, everybody, and we're all wishing you well, Debbie, if you're out there. Um, but so I'm gonna do my best to kind of give a sense of a broad overview of the Rojava Revolution, because my understanding is folks have a mixed background knowledge in this. And I'll try to intersperse some personal anecdotes, but mainly going to try to give people a clear sense of what's going on, how society is being rebuilt, reorganized, and defended in Northeast Syria. Um, because I think that that's what Debbie was going to focus on doing the most. So, before we get started, I want to give people a sense of place here, a sense of context. So I'm going to go and share my screen. All right. Folks able to see? Some nodding heads? Yes? Okay. So before we talk about sort of what Rojava is, we should probably talk about where it is. And of course, we'll try not to get into all of these rabbit holes we can go down, but this is a map of the Middle East, of much of it, rather. And this whole yellow area is what's known as Greater Kurdistan. And what we mean by Kurdistan is the historic homeland of the Kurdish people. The Kurdish people are cultural, ethnic minority, an indigenous community, you could say, in the Middle East. And they're a stateless people, a sort of stateless nation, you could say. So if you look at the borders of all of these nation states, which were, of course, drawn somewhat arbitrarily by European powers after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, these borders all go right through the historic land of the Kurdish people, breaking it up into roughly four pieces. So when you hear the word Rojava, what it really just means is west in Kurdish, in Kurmanji. And so when people say Rojava, they're talking about West Kurdistan. So if you look at the map here, that really just means the part of the Kurdish homeland that happens to find itself within the borders of the Syrian nation state. Turning to this next map here, this is a map of Syria showing the different control of territory within Syria today, roughly. It's a little bit old, but the borders are basically the same, or the boundaries, rather, we should say. And so what's happened with the Rojava Revolution is that we've all probably heard of the Syrian civil war going back over a decade now to around 2011. There were popular protests against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the dictatorial government of Syria. And these popular protests were met by heavy repression. And this democratic uprising, when facing this repression, started to militarize. Very quickly, Syria sort of devolved into sectarian violence and an all-out civil war. And without getting into all of the details, something that happened amid all of this chaos of the Syrian civil war, as things started to militarize and fracture, is that the government in Damascus, which is way down in the southwest of the country, was forced to withdraw much of its military force from the historic Kurdish region, right? So Kurdish people, just as has been the case in Turkey and Iraq and Iran, within Syria had been for years historically marginalized by what in all of these cases have been very nationalist governments, right? So in a country like Turkey, when the Turkish Republic was formed, it was a Turkish nationalist government which didn't recognize the rights of the Kurdish minority people. Same thing in Syria, right? The official name of the Syrian government is still the Syrian Arab Republic, right? Kurdish people are not Arab people, so it's a very exclusive kind of political system. So in this area where Kurdish people have been historically marginalized, a place that also, by the way, has been economically underdeveloped very intentionally, a place where it was against the law, it was prohibited for Kurdish people to speak their own language and practice their own culture. Just because of a set of circumstances that emerged during the middle of this very bloody, very chaotic civil war, a power vacuum emerged. And the truth is that the Kurdish people had a revolutionary movement of their own, going all the way back to the 70s, really, with the founding of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, or North Kurdistan, depending on who you're talking to. And this movement had its own mass base of support. It had its own organizers and revolutionaries. It had its own structures of governance and social organization, as well as self-defense. And as the government was weakened and the country kind of descended into chaos, this movement quickly took advantage of the power vacuum that emerged in the country's north and northeast, which again is a stronghold of the Kurdish communities. And they basically declared autonomy and implemented their own political vision for society based on the ideas of community self-governance. So when we talk about Rojava, we talk about the Rojava Revolution. We're talking about an autonomous region in northeast Syria, which is governed now not by a nation state, but by a confederation, if you will, of self-governed communities, is the simplest way to put it. And there are several pillars to this new governing system or self-governing system in northeast Syria, which is officially known as the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. The Kurdish movement loves their acronyms, and I'll try to keep them to a minimum. But the pillars of this movement are threefold. One, direct democracy. Two, women's autonomy. And three, social ecology. I would add in there a couple, I don't want to say extra, but a couple additional fundamental pillars of this movement of self-governance. And that is one, cooperative economy, right? What they call a social economy in Kurdish, Aburiyajivak. And lastly, this idea of cultural pluralism, right? This sort of solidaristic coexistence of the region's diverse peoples. So, amid this civil war and the emerging threats that have come not only in response to what's happening within the struggle to overthrow the Syrian government and the Syrian government's own struggle to stay in power, there also have emerged threats directly to this new autonomous region, namely that of the Turkish state and ISIS. So we've all heard of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. As soon as Kurdish communities started to govern themselves in the middle of the civil war and defend themselves, ISIS, as a political military force, tried to wipe them out, seeing them as really an anomaly, or rather a threat to their own sort of Islamo-fascist vision for society, if you will. And also, the Turkish government, for its own reasons, saw this experiment in Rojava as a direct threat to its own sort of Turkish supremacist rule in Turkey. The idea was if Kurdish people ruled themselves autonomously in Syria, there might be a risk of them doing the same in Turkey, right? So these communities have not only governed themselves, but they've had to defend themselves from these external threats that have attacked their communities, militarily occupied them, tried to commit genocide, kidnapped women, committed mass murder, really terrible atrocities over the course of this. But on the one hand, while the war in Syria is often depicted, and even the the struggle of the Kurdish people against ISIS is often depicted just as this sort of bloody war or even romanticized images of people picking up a gun and defending their community. More than anything else, Rojava is a story of society rebuilding itself and restructuring itself along radically egalitarian and democratic lines. So let's jump right into it. What is this world that Rojava is trying to build? Here's some iconic images of this is a member of the Women's Protection Units removing the flag of ISIS in a city previously occupied by ISIS. And in this moment, liberated by the Women's Protection Units, the all-women Kurdish self-defense force of the YPJ, which we'll get into. Here's an image of people mobilizing in northeast Syria, men and women together, taking to the streets to call for an end to military occupation and for the defense of their homeland. But just what is this society that is being built in Rojava? So we'll start by talking about the structures of governance in society. So in Rojava, instead of a state, which, as you could say, in the most simple way, is shaped like a pyramid, right, where power and decision-making, authority, initiative all starts at the very top in a centralized bureaucracy and it flows downward toward the people and toward local communities. The Kurdish freedom movement in Rojava is trying to build a movement that's kind of a state turned on its head. Put another way, in Rojava, the basic building block of governance and the basic building block of this new society they're trying to build is the local commune. And a local commune is a structure of community self-governance going all the way down to the neighborhood and village level, right? So just to kind of ground ourselves in the inspiring ideas of this revolution, Brian was just giving us a great overview of the ideas of social ecology and communalism. And the truth is, for those of you who don't know, there's actually direct lineage between the movement for social ecology and the Kurdish freedom movement. So, again, without trying to get into the weeds too much, the founding leader and sort of leading philosopher of the Kurdish freedom movement is a man named Abdullah Öcalan. He was the founding leader of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And Abdullah Öcalan, and by proxy, the entire Kurdish freedom movement, in the late 90s and early 2000s, went through a profound ideological transformation. So when the movement was founded, it was founded along kind of classical Marxist, Leninist, nationalist political lines, right? This is a movement that was founded at a time when they were taking inspiration from the proliferation of anti-colonial movements around the world, national liberation struggles in places like Cuba, places like Vietnam, where indigenous peoples, colonized peoples were taking up arms to overthrow despotic regimes. And so they originally saw as their goal the creation of an independent Kurdish nation state. And fast forward to a period where Abdullah Öcalan himself found himself captured and living in prison behind bars in a Turkish prison. There's an incredibly important moment where he was first exposed to the ideas of Murray Bookchin when he picked up a Turkish translation of the Ecology of Freedom. And so I don't want to reduce the Kurdish freedom movement's ideology to simply, they were Marxist-Leninists and then they learned about Murray Bookchin and then they changed their mind about everything. But in truth, it really was a profound moment and a profound influence on the movement. And it really gave sort of the fullest articulation to a kind of critical reassessment of their ideology and of their strategy that was already underway, kind of following the fall of the Soviet Union and what they call, real socialism, quote unquote. And at the center of this transformation was a reassessment of the idea of the nation state, right? So rather than seeing the nation state as the tool, right, the vehicle for transforming society towards socialism, in their words, they came to see that the nation state structure itself, right, state power itself is an obstacle to building a liberated society. It is an obstacle to overthrowing colonial social relations. So put another way, in order for the Kurdish people to liberate themselves from colonialism, they realized we will have to democratize our society from the ground up, block by block, village by village, through the creation of these forms of community self-organization, taking direct inspiration from Murray Bookchin's ideas of directly democratic community assemblies. So as you can see, these are some pictures of these ideas being put into practice. In every neighborhood, in every village in Rojava, you have what they call a commune, right? And these are hyper-local community assemblies and councils where neighbors get together. These meetings are open to everybody. They discuss the problems they're facing. They come up with solutions to address them together. They organize themselves into a variety of committees, which are rooted in the different aspects of society, right? The different kinds of problems that may need to be solved. Things like education, economy, women's organizing, youth, defense, all of these different sort of sectors of society. They form these grassroots volunteer committees down at the neighborhood level. And then they practice what they call confederalism. What the movement calls itself in terms of its ideology is democratic confederalists. And that's kind of Abdullah Öcalan's sort of Kurdish take on the ideas of communalism and social ecology. And so according to this ideology, we can't just have a bunch of isolated local community councils. We have to coordinate increasingly upward and outward from the local to the city to the regional, right? All the way up to the entire autonomous administration of Northeast Syria, which is in principle basically a confederation of these elected delegates representing structures of community self-governance from the local up to the regional. Let's see. I know we only have limited time here, so I also want to talk a little bit about the economy that they're trying to build in Rojava, right? So they're not just trying to transform the structures and practices of politics, but also of economics. So alongside the still very much existing market capitalist economy, they're trying to build sort of a new economy inside the shell of the old, if you will. And that's what they call a social economy. And it's basically an economy based on cooperatives, worker self-managed cooperatives. These are some photos I'm sharing of agricultural cooperatives, but these co-ops exist in every sector of the economy that you can imagine, in manufacturing, and food distribution, and different forms of labor. And it's the goal of the autonomous administration and of the Kurdish freedom movement to basically build up these structures from the ground up so that ultimately they can replace a capitalist economy with an economy that is based on meeting human need through sustainable ecological means, and where economic institutions, just like political institutions, are governed in directly democratic and egalitarian ways. Rushing through here a bit, there's also the question of the structures of security. We can kind of look at this on a spectrum from the military structures, which the movement has had to create rapidly to protect their region from external threats, right? We mentioned invasions by the Turkish military, which is not nothing. Turkey is the second largest military in NATO, is a serious nation state that is backed by the United States. It has jets, right? F-16s. We'll get into some of this later. Paid by US tax dollars in many ways, attacking these minority communities for the crime of governing themselves. And so they have had to create military structures. If you've heard of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the YPG and YPJ, which we mentioned a minute ago, these are kind of acronyms for the Kurdish and Kurdish-led military forces set up to protect the region from external threats. So the Syrian Democratic Forces is actually an alliance that includes not just Syrian Kurdish militias, but the self-defense forces of all kinds of other communities, right? So in Rojava, it's not just Kurdish people who live there. We're talking about Syria. This is an Arab majority country, so there's many Arab people. There's also other cultural minorities like Assyrian people and Armenian people and Turkic people. And these groups are all within the paradigm of the movement encouraged to create their own autonomous forms of organization, politically and militarily. But also, I want to say that they don't just organize to address security concerns from external threats. They also have had to create internal security forces. One of those is called the Asaish, and it's kind of like a communalist police force, if you will. You can wrestle with the contradictions there. But ISIS now, as their territory has been taken, right? No longer does ISIS control entire cities or villages that they govern. Um, that was taken from them by the Kurdish-led forces. But there are ISIS, what they call sleeper cells, that are carrying out regular terror attacks against Kurdish communities and other communities to try to come back to power. And so, you can imagine in their communities, they have to set up things like checkpoints. They have to check through cars that are driving from one region to another. They have to find out where ISIS is organizing these sleeper cells and find ways to try to arrest them. So there's been a need for an internal police force, basically, or an internal security force. And then additionally, lastly, to kind of follow their principles of community self-governance, every single neighborhood commune has its own autonomous self-defense force, and they call that the HPC, or basically the community defense force. And so if you see the woman holding a Kalashnikov rifle in the bottom right of the screen here, she's not a part of the professionalized military or police force. She is a part of her commune's self-defense community. And so she is just volunteering to patrol her community, in this case, to play the role of security at a public demonstration. And so they're really trying to get communities to self-organize from the bottom up. And lastly, before I kind of turn it back over to you all, it's really important to mention the centrality of gender in the Rojava Revolution. So, another way that the ideas of social ecology has influenced the Kurdish freedom movement has to do with their historic conception of patriarchy and women's liberation. I would go as far as to say they took these ideas even further than Murray had articulated, Murray Bookchin. But Murray, in his work, he had already started to talk about how, in tracing the roots of hierarchy back to the earliest human communities, that you could see that forms of gender hierarchy were some of the earliest forms of social domination that emerged in human society. And the Kurdish movement really takes this idea extremely seriously. Abdullah Öcalan says woman is the first colony, woman is the first slave. And so the Kurdish movement then has taken this idea not just as an abstract ideological concept that, okay, yeah, someday it's going to be important to truly liberate society. We'll have to have women's freedom too. No, no, no. They see women's freedom as central right here and right now. And that means that in every structure of society, both in these councils that I've described as the governing structures in the political realm, as well as in the defense structures in the military realm, women organize their own autonomous parallel organizations, right? So they have their civil society organizations and they have all women's defense forces that have full autonomy over their own decision making. Every single position of political and military leadership has a male and female co-chair. And lastly, whenever there's a decision that particularly affects women or children, women's organizations have veto power within the decision-making bodies over this decision. Sometimes in social movements today, we hear this slogan, nothing about us without us. I think you could see a kind of parallel in the Kurdish women's movement and their approach, right? So in any of these governing structures, they even now have a 50% gender quorum or quota. In other words, if there's not 50% women representation in the leadership body of a decision-making structure, the decision is seen as illegitimate, right? Because the full representation of the community is not there. So we could get into all of this. I think there was some interest in hearing what's happening latest on the ground. Um, so before I turn it back over, I will just say that there's been a lot of dramatic changes in the last 6 months to a year. Last winter, the Syrian regime was overthrown by a jihadist organization called HTS. So there's a new president of Syria named al-Shara, and there's a complicated process of negotiation taking place now because the Kurdish-led movement in northeast Syria, their own defense forces and their administration, as well as this new Syrian state, are both trying to come to some agreement whereby an all-out war could be avoided. And there's a tentative decision to integrate this administration, the Kurdish-led autonomous administration, and its defense forces into the Syrian state, which may sound like a crazy contradiction, and it is in some ways, but the devil's in the details. And what the movement is insisting on is that whatever shape this new Syrian constitution takes, that it needs to be a decentralized system of governance that recognizes the right of women and cultural minorities to political and cultural participation. And a constitution should also, they say, recognize the right of these communities to continue to maintain these structures and practices of self-defense and local self-governance, which they have already built and are already using to practice their own forms of self-determination. So what is going to happen? It is yet to be seen, but this is a very critical moment for the future of Rojava and for the future of these ideas. So we encourage everybody to get in touch if you want to learn more, if you want to find out how you can support the movement, get in touch with the Emergency Committee for Rojava. You can check out our website, which is just defendrojava.org. You can find us on social media. If you want to reach out directly, you can write me an email at info@defendrojava.org. But we're really encouraging everybody. I'll drop some links in the chat. We're encouraging people to contact the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this week because Trump has just announced that he has invited the new president of Syria to visit the White House in Washington, D.C. And this is paradoxically the new president of Syria is a former member of Al-Qaeda, the crazy times we live in. And it may seem wild to, reach out to like a Republican head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to convince Donald Trump of anything. But the truth is the United States has its own cynical interests in Syria and has been a real ally to the Syrian Democratic Forces. And when the stakes are this high, we encourage ourselves and our friends to kind of get over our habits of kind of political purity and say, okay, let's be pragmatic, and if our friends in Northeast Syria need our help, let's go ahead and reach out and express to our members of Congress that it's incredibly important that Trump does not sort of betray the U.S. allies of the Kurdish communities in Syria, and that the U.S. insists that the new constitution in Syria recognize explicit rights of self-determination and self-defense. So I'll shut myself up there. I sure hope I didn't eat too much into the rest of the time. There's a lot of ground to cover in a quick presentation, but thanks again for having me join you all today at the last minute.
Thank you, Arthur. And that was brilliant. You and Brian have covered so much territory in the time that you had. And there are some questions in the chat that we can start with, but I just want to thank you and congratulate you on how much you were able to cover and how up to date you brought things as well. So there's still very much of interest going on in that part of the world that you describe. And thank you also for making that connection explicit to this kind of fringe philosopher from Burlington, Vermont, known as not Bernie Sanders, some might think, but Murray Bookchin. And they had an interesting kind of history as well when Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington. To some extent, sympathetic history and to some extent critical, but I won't get into that. So let's start with a few questions that are there in the chat. I think Jason Brown had a question which I will, sorry, it's for Brian, and I'll read it out. Burning question, he calls it. Murray Bookchin had beef with lots of lefties, but his dispute with the deep ecologists was particularly notable. And I do recall a long-running dispute with somebody by the name of Dave Foreman. I don't know how well known he is nowadays, but back then he was quite in the news for some radical environmentalist actions at the beginnings of the organization known as Earth First, which later became quite well known for some tree sits intended to stop old growth forest logging in California on the west coast of the US. In fact, actions that were mirrored by somewhat similar protests in right here where we are in British Columbia, Western Canada, that were a little bit different philosophically. That brings us to these debates that were ongoing in the 1980s and 1990s between social ecologists like Murray Bookchin, so-called deep ecologists or biocentrists like Dave Foreman and others, and ecofeminists who happened to be more influential here on the West Coast in the massive movement intended to prevent old growth logging in Clayoquot Sound. And that movement resulted in some pretty interesting results over the years, but we won't get into that. So back to Jason's question. Did Murray Bookchin ever come around to the importance of spirituality in human life and his vision for a more decentralized politics? Did he ever acknowledge that his analysis is as much about our ideas as it is about our material realities? So glad to hear the Institute is still going. So as much about the ideas and the kind of spirituality, however we define that term, infusing some of those ideas for some of those people. And that was often the case with some of the Earth First activists as well. So over to you, Brian.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a really important one. And I think, excuse me, I think I want to begin by talking about Murray's focus on ideas in general, and then I'll, excuse me, get more specifically into the question about spirituality. If you look at the book, The Ecology of Freedom, which is widely seen as Bookchin's magnum opus, this is one of several editions that's been available over the years. There's a recent reissue from AK Press in California. If you look at the ecology of freedom and his exploration of the origins of hierarchy and domination and how that affected people's and society more broadly's views toward nature throughout the centuries, you will find that the ecology of freedom is very much an idea-centered work. He looks at the role of a whole host of cultural and religious developments in parallel to political developments and how they shaped what he viewed as a dual legacy of domination and freedom and a contention between legacies of domination and freedom throughout certainly Western history, which is really the focus. So Murray was very much about acknowledging and elaborating a history of ideas. There is a major unpublished work, which I know Debbie and others are in the process of trying to get into print, called The Politics of Cosmology, which was Bookchin's exploration of the long legacy of nature philosophy, begin in the West again, beginning with the pre-Socratics, the role of Greek and Roman philosophy, and on through the evolution of Western philosophy. So Murray was very much about the history of ideas. He called his nature philosophy dialectical naturalism, in part as a way to get beyond the limitations of the kind of crude materialism that had become the norm in Marxist circles. Spirituality is a little more complicated. And because of the ways in which many deep ecologists, including Dave Foreman in Earth First, and I'll mention that when Dave Foreman left Earth First, it evolved in a much more progressive and often overtly leftist direction. The kind of quasi-reactionary tendencies that Foreman and others represented in the early years of Earth First became almost completely discredited after about 10 years. And the folks that came to the forefront had an overtly leftist, overtly feminist perspective, which was a really positive change. But because of this odd alliance of people like Foreman, whose politics were overtly misanthropic, viewing humanity per se as kind of a cancer on nature and an obstacle to the renewal of biodiversity, and this weird alliance between that branch of what became known as deep ecology and the more spiritual side of deep ecology, represented by uh, people like Bill Duvall, who's a philosophy professor in Northern California, who was one of the leading writers on deep ecology, and many ecofeminists who identified with deep ecology, bioregionalists like Kirkpatrick Sale, who identified with deep ecology. Because of the alliance between the kind of misanthropic side of Earth First and the deep ecology spiritualists, uh, Bookchin tended to have a much more negative view of the role of spirituality in politics. In fact, he repeatedly emphasized that this kind of unholy alliance of views reminded him of the ways that spiritual ideas in the West and the legacy of German Romanticism had been co-opted by the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and became such a central element in their ability to gain hegemony over German culture. So that alliance among deep ecologists reminded Murray of some of the worst uh, aspects of recent European history, and therefore came to a view that while it's fine for people to hold on to a personal spiritual outlook in their own work, that mixing spirituality and politics was inherently a dangerous thing and inherently tended to skew discussions toward the one that legitimized far right and racist and reactionary understandings. I think many of us around the Institute had a somewhat more uh, generous view toward some of the spiritual tendencies that existed during that time when deep ecology was so popular. Um, certainly in the ecology of freedom, there's a lot of acknowledgement and embracing of the spiritual dimensions of indigenous worldviews and how they helped further an outlook of rooted in reciprocity, rooted in a deep sense of what he called consociation and intimacy between human cultures and the rest of the natural world. But in response to that alliance of um, deep ecology, spiritualism, and the kind of eco-brutalism of the folks, some of whom were profoundly reactionary, including Dave Foreman, including another prominent deep ecology philosopher who was a colleague of Bill Duvall's named George Sessions. Uh, it reinforced his bias that linking spirituality and politics is inherently dangerous and reactionary.
Thank you.
And we can debate what that means in the present, but that's the reality that Murray was responding to at the time.
Yeah, I think it's a huge question that we could spend a lot more time on. But without going back to the 1980s or 1990s, if we kind of can leave the last few questions to the present, there is one more question in the chat, but I also want to open things up to the classroom. If anyone here has any questions to either of the speakers or anyone else online, um, kind of up to date questions before we wrap up, which we have to do in 7 or 8 minutes.
Oh, sorry to go on so long. I didn't realize the timing was so tight.
If nothing else is coming up, I will read another question that is in the chat. Can you expand on, and this is to Arthur, can you expand on what institutional features make the police force communalist? So the police force in Rojava. For example, do citizens rotate in and out of the community defense force? Are its members democratically recallable? So this is also getting into the technicalities of things on the ground, which, as I understand, are somewhat variable from place to place and perhaps a little shifting as well. But Arthur, would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question, and it is kind of a mouthful to say such a thing as communalist police force, right? But maybe I'm being a little bit provocative. There are people who sort of trying to describe the Asaish as something that's not a police force, and I think that's a little bit splitting hairs. It's not really helping us kind of understand what's happening on the ground. I think to answer the question in the most direct possible way, institutionally, the Asaish, they have their own internal command structure, but ultimately they're accountable to their corresponding community council. They are made up of, the local forces are made up of all local residents. Now you have to serve in the community that you live in. There's an all women's Asaish that's in parallel to the men's Asaish, and if there's an issue affecting women in particular, it is the women Asaish who have full authority to respond. There are ideological differences in the sense that the training process is not just a sort of tactical training that they receive. They receive political education first and foremost to be kind of steeped in these liberatory ideas of, direct democracy and feminism, etc. They don't use that word feminism, but women's autonomy. So I think these are all important differences from what we see in, your average state police department here. But I also, again, I think like there are similarities too. It is a professionalized security force. It has its own command structure. And its job is ultimately to enforce the laws of Rojava. Rojava has its own social contract, constitution, if you will. But maybe just to like wrap it up, I think we can see this within a broader context. We didn't have time to get into sort of like the challenges and the contradictions of the revolution and all of that. We can do that another time. But I think it's a really helpful way to look at this revolution and its contradictions is to try to, through inspiration from social ecology, and yet another way, take a kind of dialectical perspective and to see this revolution as a process that's continuing to unfold, not as a sort of fixed institutional state that either perfectly embodies the ideas or fails to embody the ideas, right? It's a process that's evolving and unfolding. And that means that the old continues to exist alongside the new. There are forms of governance that are more centralized, if for no other reason, because not every place and every sphere of society is experiencing high levels of participation and political consciousness, right? So you can have the structure of an assembly system, but if nobody comes to the assembly, is the community governing itself just because there's a structure there, right? So Rojava and putting these ideas into practice shows us in a very rich, messy way what it looks like to put ideas like this into practice on the ground, right? So even in the justice system, you have things that are more like courts and police or asayish, right? And they're trying to transform these things to be more libertarian versions of themselves. But they also, in a kind of dual power way, they're building these alternative grassroots structures that embody this totally new bottom-up way of doing things, right? So some problems are solved increasingly through what they call reconciliation councils, which are an alternative to any kind of state struck justice system where people in the local community they come together and a council helps them facilitate a conversation of reconciliation and conflict resolution. And in many ways, to wrap it up, the way I would describe it is that this idea of dual power, right, of building the new within the shell of the old, these counterpower institutions that represent the alternative, this tension of dual power, it actually exists in Rojava after and during the revolution, right? So not just historically, this concept of dual power is like, maybe people create these grassroots institutions that represent this other way of governing, and that way, those structures overthrow the state and become the new governing structure. In Rojava, you see in this dialectical way, again, the old exists alongside the new, and they continue to try to build the power of self-governance through this concept of dual power, even though the tension lives on, right? There's always this tension of whether or not the decisions will end up being made by the people who themselves are assembling, or whether these decisions will be made on by the people who are delegated into leadership positions. And that is based on context, depends on whether people are stepping into leadership and participating, whether people have the level of political education to see responsibility for participating. And that's continuing to live and grow and evolve as we speak. There's currently a process underway to try to reinvigorate the communes themselves, recognizing that they have had challenges in getting people to participate in some communities. And I'm hopeful, cautiously optimistic, that these things can continue to evolve and improve in the revolution if they can just find a way again to hold on to that autonomy and to continue to defend themselves amid these newly emerging threats of the new regime. So I'll stop there. I probably went over. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. And you've kind of answered the last question that was added
Oh,
to the well. So at this point, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to join us with your rich insights. I want to come back to the question that we opened with, how another world may be possible. If I had to answer that question right now after listening to the two of you, I would say through a lot of hard hands-on work, it may be possible to have a somewhat different world to look forward to. Thank you again for your time, everyone else who's joined us to watch this. The recording will be available in the coming days. It will be placed online, along with some recommended follow-up readings for anyone interested. So keep your eye open for that. I also want to say that there will not be a first Tuesday webinar in December. but we will be back in the new year in February, March, and April. And in February, we're planning a webinar featuring Ukrainian activists and scholars discussing hope in times of another war that's ongoing. And also in celebration of the publication of the book Terra Invicta, Ukrainian Wartime Reimaginings for a Habitable Earth, which is coming out in a couple of weeks through McGill Queen's University Press. Thank you again, and we will wrap it up at this point. Arthur, you're still on screen. If you can close your video, then we will allow people to thank both of you. Okay, I guess we can